Welcome back. Climate Tech Talks is delighted to be hosting a very special episode today with Clearbot's founder Sidhant Gupta, who has revolutionized ocean cleaning efforts in countries like Hong Kong, India, Panama. During this interview, we will gain valuable insights into the development process of his pioneering technology, Clearbot, and get a glimpse of what inspired its inception and explore potential directions for further exploration within the field.
Before we get started, let's give our listeners a proper introduction. I am Tom Corbin, the co-founder of RH Studio, a digital agency based right here in Hong Kong. I'm joined by Sam Cooke, the co-founder and CEO of CarbonX, a B2B environmental startup. And of course, we are delighted to host Sidhant Gupta, founder of Clearbot, an AI robotics company focused on pollution cleanup in waterways. And he is also the recipient of a Guinness World Record in robotics. So for anyone who does not know what Clearbot is, Sidhant, can you help give our listeners a quick summary and a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure, Tom, thanks. Clearbots are basically self-driving, emission-free robotic boats, right? And these boats can kind of go around in the water on their own. They can be charged with solar power, so it's kind of completely fueled without any kind of internal combustion, and they can go around and do a bunch of tasks. And one of the coolest things we can do is actually collect trash and garbage out of the water, which, if you're in Hong Kong, you'd know is a huge problem in our waterways, right? And the entire idea is that this process can be done without humans being on the ground, and that basically makes the whole process a lot more scalable. And using a bit of machine learning, we're also able to generate a lot of data about what's actually in the water, right? And hopefully bring a little more transparency into this whole process.
Brilliant, fantastic. And what's the kind of journey that brought you to kind of develop Clearbot? What's your background? Let's give our listeners a little bit of a history.
Sure. I mean, for me personally, I grew up in Bangalore in India, which is a city that is, well, today kind of the startup capital of India. So there's a lot of tech, and definitely the environment's very like startup company, right? So I kind of grew up in that, and my parents run a small factory. So I've kind of grown up around machines, and so I've always been fascinated by them. So in India, I started building robots when I was 16, and actually I broke a national record in India. First making the smallest walking robot there, just for kicks. And when I came to Hong Kong, I started to look at if I could break a world record. There's a logical thing to do, right?
Yeah.
So it's a logical next step. So I started looking into what was possible to break, and I found this category for a robotic fish. And so I started working on trying to build the world's fastest robotic fish, right? And cutting a long story short, I mean, that's kind of how I started. As a result of this, I started to organize a lot of projects at the University of Hong Kong around the marine environment, right? Because I was doing robotics and water already. And I was in Bali in 2019 with a couple of my friends, and we were basically on the beach, and we noticed that there were people going out, like, all the guys who own shops on the beaches or rent out surfboards. They were basically going out and collecting the trash out of the water by hand, right, with nets. And it looked like a bit, well, ridiculous is the word, I guess, right? It was a bit crazy to watch people just do this. And then we started talking to them, and we figured that, for them, well, first of all, there's a lot of trash in the water. And if they don't clean it up, no one comes to their beach because, the beach gets dirty, surfers don't like dirty beaches and so on. And then we found out that, okay, the government's actually paying for a lot of this stuff, but the best way to clean it out is to go out on a paddle boat and a net, right? And that's simply not scalable enough, right? If you look at the amount of trash there is. So we kind of went like, okay, there has to be a better way. And that's kind of where the idea of Clearbot was born. And we actually prototyped our first bot on the beach there.
Amazing.
Sidhant, obviously you've been working in the marine pollution sector for a while. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit about what the primary problems are, and because what you're doing is you're a little bit the solution for the symptoms, right? But you're not fixing the root cause. So can you explore a little bit more? Where are the root causes coming from? How is the trash getting there? And what do we do to turn off this trash?
Sure, that's a great question, Sam. So if you fundamentally look at the ocean waste problem, right, it's pretty much a waste management problem, really, on land, right? And if you go sort of down the cycle, so there's many schools of thought. One says that you improve recycling systems, right? And this is actually what's being pushed by a lot of the big firms, saying that, hey, like if we have better recycling, then a lot of this waste goes back into the system and doesn't end up in the water or anywhere else, right? But then the second school of thought, which I think is more correct personally, is that the materials themselves need to be changed, right? So plastic is this wonder material that's now in every single product, and that's great, right? I don't think plastic needs to be moved out, but I think single-use plastic specifically, right, is the problem, because you're now buying something that's super permanent that you're using just once for like a couple of seconds, or right? And so eventually, I think the solution here is to control the material that's going into single-use plastic, right, and make that more sustainable and biodegradable, or and that's how we're going to solve this problem. And actually, I think so. The challenge here is that the companies aren't really incentivized to do this today, right? And the best incentive you can give them, honestly, is policy that makes it harder for them to continue using regular plastic in single-use cases, at least. And so I think data really matters. That's where it comes in, because governments are slow, and for them to make these decisions, they usually have lobbies that are against them. And so having real data on the ground that, hey, this is what's in the water, or this is where it's leaking, and this is why trying to manage the waste won't work. Having that data is actually really important for them to be able to push a material change and actually solve this problem at source, so to speak.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're actually having similar issues with a waste management project for hospitality. The issue with the government is that they just don't have the data, like you said, to justify the policies they need to make. So, Sid, based on your research on Hong Kong, India, and Panama's oceans, what kind of composition were you seeing of waste in the water, and how do you think artificial intelligence assists with the cleanup of such waste?
Sure, that's a great question, Tom. So I think, well, for starters, in terms of what we're seeing, honestly, it's just packaging. And that's why I'm so convinced that packaging is literally the problem, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not like you don't see other stuff, but the percentage of it is so much smaller that in the grand scheme of things, that's not what's causing the issue, right? So I think it's just different kinds of packaging. It could be food boxes, it can be plastic bags, it could be bottles. It's just packaging for stuff, right? And it's just all over. And most of it's leaking in, it's usually runoff, right? So for example, we'll see that when it rains, the amount of trash in the water across, this is globally, any of our sites, the amount of trash just goes up like mad, right? And so there's a very direct correlation here between how the water is basically carrying this from the land into the ocean, right? And because that's its natural flow. So that's kind of where it's coming from, and what kind of material it is. And in terms of the AI side of it, right? So there's two sides. The first is what we're doing directly is data collection, right? And so, for example, on our machines, every time you collect a piece of trash, as it goes up that conveyor belt, we're actually taking a photograph. The machine learning is figuring out, what is this? Is this a bottle, a bag? Is it unidentifiable? All right, right? Or a mask maybe, right? So it figures that out, and we get that data back. And that's really good because, again, if the government needs to make these decisions, frankly, even if NGO groups need to push the government to make these decisions, they need that data to back it up, right? And so that starts to make sense. So that's the first layer where AI adds value. And then the second thing I think is a bit more bigger picture, which is if I look at environmental issues generally, right, there are two spaces, so two kind of problems here. The first is a lack of understanding, which is what the data is kind of solving, right? It gives us more granularity. But then there's also a lack of resources, right? And what I mean by this is like we're looking at a huge problem, and the government has a teeny tiny budget to try and solve this problem, right? And they have bigger problems. I mean, in their view, like whatever, education, hospitals, like all that's a bigger issue,
COVID.
Right? So now we look at this and we're like, okay, based on this budget, even in just Hong Kong, right, you can only hire so many people and so many boats. Like there is a certain cost of renting a boat, there's a certain cost of hiring a person, and there's only so much that can be done, right? And so arguably AI gives us the ability, AI and robotics, at least when combined, gives us the ability to say that, hey, if I can only hire, let's say 100 people, at least I'm not now running only 40 boats with those 100 people. I can now run 400 boats with those 100 people because the AI can do things semi-autonomously, or can take away a lot of that simple work that maybe somebody's doing. And now people become more at a sort of supervisory level. Right, and so I think the sort of AI and robotics thing that's coming in allows us to build artificial resources. And a great example is, a lot of the malls in Hong Kong during COVID had these little machines that were going around doing disinfecting, right? Some of it was gimmicky, but some of it was real, right? Especially in these large sort of cargo containers, like what do you do? Cargo holding spaces. So I think it's the same thing for the water, right? Where the robots can add a lot of value, and the artificial intelligence can add a lot of value in terms of creating artificial resources.
So the next question is a little bit of a two-part. The first one is about your expansion plans. So you're already in India, Hong Kong, and Panama. Where are you looking at expanding to next? And the second one is this idea of, we've heard forever about SaaS, right? Software as a service. Are we ever going to see a time where we're going to see robots as a service? I can just rent a robot for a day or two to do X, Y, Z.
Sure, it's a great question, Sam. So first, in terms of us, I mean, to be honest, for the next at least 2 years, I think we're going to double down on the locations we're in. For example, India is huge. Right? We're barely scratching the surface. And even in Hong Kong, I mean, we have a couple of boats here, but it's not nearly as big as I think it can be. So for the moment, we're actually going to focus on doubling down and really getting this right, because if we can prove this model in a couple of locations, then it's relatively easier to then scale it up elsewhere. So that's kind of the plan for now. And in terms of the actual model, so I love how you brought up robots as a service, right? So when we started this business, we found that people are, I mean, at least most of our clients are quite risk averse, right? Like governments, property companies. They're not people who like to take a chance, burn some money.
Of course.
So,
fair.
So we found that, when we were trying to sell them a robot, they were a bit afraid. Right? They're a bit like, hey, I don't know, this thing is new, I don't know how to maintain it. And I'm just like, but when you offer them the service, they're really happy to buy that because they're already paying on a monthly basis for some contractor to do this, right? So actually, in their view, adopting the robot is now the cheaper option as well as the environmentally better option. And so what we found is that the robots as a service model allows people to adopt sort of robotic services, literally, like the robots very quickly, and allows companies like us to scale our services and our solutions quite fast. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it. In fact, we're already seeing that, as I said, in malls, you see these disinfecting robots. Most of them are on a service basis, right? And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And especially in the sustainability space, right, where I think people, again, it's a new space, so I think people are still more sort of open to risk, but there's not a lot of affordability. And so the ability to try something for a few months before you actually kind of double down and commit to it is really important. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this business model over the next few years.
And how are you finding in not to say restrictions, but things like regulations? Obviously, putting out an AI robot to patrol the seas where there are boats and ships, going by. I think you have some sort of detection system built in. But can you talk a little bit about the kind of challenges there in terms of working with the ocean compared to being, which could potentially be a little bit more volatile than working on land?
No, absolutely. I mean, we have on the technology side, we have a lot of sensors. We have object avoidance, we have LiDAR, basically to make sure we're never going to bump into another boat. And then a lot of sort of technology goes into detecting objects in the water and sort of managing that, because the water is a very chaotic environment. So you don't have a static background like you do on land, right? So there's a lot of that we do. But also on the regulatory side, it's pretty interesting, right? So I think when we started off, actually there was, I mean, even now in Hong Kong, actually there's no real regulation for this kind of boat, right? Yeah. However, smart ports started becoming a thing about 10 years ago, and now everyone's trying to get in on board. And as a result, a lot of these, we call them ASVs, right? Basically, unmanned autonomous surface vehicles. This class of machine has started to become an actual classified thing, right? And so, for example, the UK, Netherlands, even Singapore now has some regulation to license these and officially operate these, right? And I think, so Hong Kong's also getting on the smart port boat, literally. And I think over the next 1 or 2 years, they'll actually implement that scheme. But there seems to be, the good news for us is that there seems to be regulation coming in, and that just makes it easier for us to operate. And in the meantime, it's kind of like what drones were, I guess, in 2013, which is, hey, unless something is like screwing up, we don't have a problem with it, I guess. Brilliant. So it's open game for now. But yeah.
Fantastic. I guess another question I have would be looking to the future. What is the future of autonomous vehicles? How can we scale this up to solve a worldwide problem? Do you see autonomous vehicles or robots being restricted to governments and businesses? Do you think it could be something that could potentially be crowdfunded by the public? And can we eventually get to a point where we have a fleet of robots cleaning our oceans that are, effectively run by charitable donations? Or how do you think that the public can kind of participate in helping solve this problem with autonomous vehicles?
That's a great question. So I'll start with, weirdly, our story in Bali, right? So we started this thing looking at these communities and trying to figure out, okay, how can we build something that they can use, but they don't have to go out and try to clean their water with, I don't know, their hands or with a net. Like, that was the original motivation here, right? And when we started building our machine, to be honest with you, we were doing it in Hong Kong, and we figured that the unit economics work out in Hong Kong, but I can't imagine a community in Indonesia or India for picking up one of our machines. It's too expensive, it doesn't make sense for them. But then we figured out that, hey, look, actually, in order to make this work, we need to scale up the sort of manufacturing, the number of units. And what happens is, again, you start getting economies of scale. So the cost of each of these things goes down. And again, you have more data, so the AI gets better, the reliability gets better because the team learns more. And so if we're able to scale up to a certain number of units, actually we'll start to bring the cost down enough that a community can just pick up one of these machines. And so the way you have a local garbage truck, it shouldn't be strange to have your own Clearbot if you have a water body going through your village or waterfront that's dirty, right? And that's kind of what we want to do. So I think the idea of starting off with businesses and the government is the right approach. And eventually they're the big sort of buyers. They're going to make this normal. But that's exactly the point at which the community starts to come in, right? Which is when we start to see this thing and it starts to become more normal, I think people are going to be more open to adopt it for their own, let's call it backyard, right? And I think with that starts to come the scalability of this, right? So, and finally, in terms of actually backing it, as you said, through charitable donations, I actually think that there's enough, so to speak, budget or interest within the governments and private companies already to solve this problem, right? A lot of, to be honest, a lot of our work is backed by private companies who want to be part of doing good, right? So, yes, it can be crowdfunded, but I think actually there's enough fund and resources on the table. I mean, that's not the constraint here, right? And so, really it's a matter of making the technology easy enough, accessible enough, reliable enough. And if we're able to do that, we'll actually potentially see this future become a reality, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay. So, Tom, I think that's all the time we have for today. Sidhant, thank you very much for coming on today. So if our listeners would like to learn more about Clearbot and know a bit more about what you do, where can they find more information?
Sure, Sam. They can find us on our website at clearbot.org, and there's a little contact form there, so just shoot us an email. And yeah, thanks for having me over.
All right. So if you found this content useful, please subscribe from wherever you're listening from. And
thank you very much for watching. Until next time.